Bob's with me here in Studio Q. Hello.
Hello,
How
and
you
thank you
doing?
for having me here. I'm fine. A little chilly, but I'm from New York,
Yeah, fair
so
enough. It is winter in Canada and the U.S. Um, in that introduction there, it seems almost incongruous to use Ronald Reagan and Andy Warhol in the same sentence. People often remark about you, Bob, that what seems like a deep contradiction about you, not just about the people you cover, but about how you self-describe. So you were at the center of this key counterculture movement, people with very liberal values, the scene around Andy Warhol in the factory, and but you also identify as a libertarian, a conservative, a Republican.
a reactionary.
Well, how do you reconcile all those aspects, or do you?
Well, I think, you can, I think being Catholic sort of helps, or being brought up Catholic anyway, because you sort of, whenever you ask a question, if there's ever a contradiction, the nuns would say to you, it's a mystery or it's a miracle. And I think, life is full of contradictions. I can look at the big picture. And in the big picture, for where our culture and where our society, our civilization is going, I think it's a disaster. And I think that's why, I used to be conservative, I'm almost reactionary now. It's like Bill Buckley saying, he was standing athwart history saying stop. But, as a person, my life is not so perfect. And I'm very interested in everything that's new, everything is avant-garde. I was part of the baby boomer generation. We were the first generation to really get into sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And, I'm complicated, and I think the world is complicated, and
So you
I
don't
go with it.
see the dichotomy.
Yes,
only
I
on-
do. I went. I have a bachelor's degree from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Then I got an MFA in film from Columbia University. So right there, I've always had these two, very different interests in politics and art. But when I went to work for Andy Warhol and at the factory, and Andy always liked to take a little entourage wherever he went, when I started going with him to Park Avenue dinner parties and fancy places in Paris and Rome and London. I sort of saw that at the top, at the apex of society, there's not really such a separation between the art world and the political world and the social world. It kind of all comes together into this elite, and that's what fascinates me really is the interrelationships, the activities, the mores of the elite really. I am an elitist, or at least I'm covering the elite, let's put it that way. I'm not as rich as any of my subjects or as famous, but I'm a journalist observing the scene.
And when you were working closely with Andy Warhol, this was for years. You're editing Interview magazine. You're being part of this elite group around his factory in New York City. What was it? How was it, and what was it about Andy that drew you in?
Well, I was interested in Andy before I met him. Like a lot of young people or a lot of Americans, we saw photographs of his Marilyns, Liz, Elvis paintings in Life magazine, and I thought, wow, if this is art, I like art because, I liked Elvis and I liked Marilyn and went to their movies. And then while I was at Georgetown in 1965, Chelsea Girls, Andy's big underground opus, played in Washington, and it was a 7-hour film but on 2 screens, and so it was 3.5 hours of people at the Chelsea Hotel, various drug addicts and gay people, and all leading these, bizarre, what at the time seemed like very bizarre lives. And I was just, like a lot of my friends, just saying, wow, this is like the first guy who's really showing what's going on with our generation. We were all rebels. I was brought up Republican, but I was in the SDS at Georgetown. I'm always, and then I just thought he was cool. I thought he was like Mick Jagger or William Burroughs or Susan Sontag. He was part of the avant-garde, of what was happening.
And how did you get to know him?
Well, at Columbia Film School, I actually majored in film criticism, and I wrote some film reviews for some underground newspapers, and Andy started reading them. And I got a call one day. I was back living with my parents in the suburbs because they said, well, we thought you wanted to be a diplomat. Now you want to be a filmmaker. Well, your sisters are in college now. we'll pay the tuition at Columbia, but we can't afford to get you an apartment in Manhattan. So I was having dinner with my parents when the phone rang, and it was the editor of the then very fledgling little magazine called Interview, saying that Andy Warhol and Paul Morrissey, who directed his films, had read my reviews, and they wanted to meet me and see if I would be interested in writing for their magazine.
Like the kinds of calls we all get at dinner.
Yeah,
Hey,
no,
it's Andy Warhol.
I know. My father was like, if you go meet that creep who makes these movies about boys who think they're girls, I'll break your legs. And my father rarely talked like that. He was kind of a Italian-American, but very sort of waspy in his way. He was very Wall Street. But that would be the typical reaction of every middle-class parent in 1970 to their son being offered a job with Andy Warhol.
I mean, a part of Warhol's approach, you take people considered on the outside, drag queens like Cindy Darling, for example, turning them into a type of celebrity through his work. What do we learn from the factory about the nature of celebrity culture?
Well, I think Andy really was, fame was what his work was really about in a lot of ways. And he, as a child, was obsessed with fame. And he wrote away to the Hollywood studios to get free autographed photos of Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland. He is famous for saying, in the future, everyone will be famous for 15 minutes. I think he sort of predicted this kind of celebrity culture taking over the culture at large. And the media kind of becoming the most important element of our society in a way. I mean, Watergate represented the Fourth Estate, the media impeaching a president. It wasn't Congress who did it. Celebrity used to mean you were celebrated for your accomplishments. It now just means you're famous or even infamous, for basically doing nothing. I think Andy kind of took these drag queens and heiresses and amphetamine addicts and made them into what he called superstars. I mean, they weren't really even stars, but it was a form of reality TV. I mean, it was all. I think Andy was always playing with the notion of fame and what is it about and why this obsession in our culture with fame.
Well, this idea of making a nobody into a somebody, if I can put it that way, very prominent in 2014. Just curious, what would Warhol have thought of someone, I don't know, a Kim Kardashian?
Well, I think he would have been dating Kim Kardashian, and we would be having a fight about whether to put her on the cover of Interview or not. I'd say no, and he'd be, oh, Bob, she's really nice when you get to know her. But I'd be, Andy, we're supposed to be an upscale magazine. Yeah, I think he would have loved it all. I think he would have been the king of Instagram, But he had the luxury of doing that because he actually had accomplished something. He had made great artworks, and his films were very important. And he was really a worker. He took thousands of photographs, every week when he was out at night. He tape recorded everybody. He was really almost a sociologist and a philosopher, I'd say, as much as he was a painter and an artist. He was obsessed with trying to figure out his time and human relationships. He maybe because he just wasn't that good at them himself, he was always trying to figure out how people got together and what made them do the things they do. He was extremely curious. And most people, when they met him, were kind of taken aback because he would be so much more interested in them than in talking about himself, and they thought, here's this huge star, and he's asking me about, what I eat for dinner or who I go to bed with, because he'd cover the range.
I could talk to you at length about Andy Warhol, but I want to bring Reagan into our conversation. Because again, these seem like, very oppositional or very different types of people. But you have drawn these comparisons between Reagan and Warhol. You described Reagan as the first pop president. Just lay this out for me, Bob. Where do you see the similarities?
Well, on a biographical level, they both are great American success stories. They both came from the middle of nowhere and went all the way to the top of their fields. Even when they were on the top, they weren't taking that seriously. It's only later that we see Reagan as a really transformational president, the way FDR was, and historians more and more write about him that way. It was only after Andy's death that the Museum of Modern Art gave him a retrospective, and we now realize how influential he was. But I think they're two sides of the same, American coin. of late, they represent Andy, the 60s counterculture, the sex, drugs, and rock and roll revolution. And then Reagan was the 80s sort of restoration. He actually, when he ran for governor in the 60s in California, ran against the hippies and the rock stars. And so I think, they're also, they both were very simple in a lot of ways. They weren't intellectuals. They were even anti-intellectuals. Andy had a few good ideas. One was photography as art. Another was fame. Ronald Reagan had a couple of good ideas, too. Anti-communism, defeat the evil empire, try to make the government smaller. He didn't really succeed in that. But he did succeed in bringing down the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain, along with the Pope, Thatcher, and Gorbachev himself, who realized it was a losing battle and kind of gave in.
Are they just rolling in their graves if they're hearing you talk about comparing them to one another?
Well, actually, the way I met Nancy and Ronald Reagan was through a friend of Andy's called Jerry Zipkin, who was, a man about town who knew Andy from the 1950s and always was supportive of his art, always tried to have rich ladies have their portraits done. He was kind of just, a socialite, really, but he was also Nancy Reagan's best friend in New York. And that's how I was introduced to the Reagans at a dinner at Le Cirque by Jerry Zipkin. And, and Nancy's best girlfriend was called Betsy Bloomingdale from Los Angeles. We'd see her all the time at parties in New York. So it wasn't like these two separate worlds, Andy in the 70s was mostly doing commissioned portraits, which meant he was out in society a lot. And that was very much the world of the Reagans.
And you could also argue that JFK, iconic, clearly aware of the power of imagery. What's a distinction for you between a figure like JFK and Reagan?
Well, again, not as much as one might think. JFK was the first president to really lower taxes and set off a boom. Ronald Reagan always referred to Kennedy's example, but Nancy modeled herself very much on Jackie. She doesn't really like to hear that, but she hired Jackie's social secretary to be her advisor during the transition into the White House. Andy was not only painted Jackie before he knew her, but he became friends with Jackie. And Jackie and Nancy got to know each other, too. So, again, there's not such a big separation. I think what the Kennedy administration and the Kennedys as a first couple and the Reagans as a first couple and had in common is they were both very social administrations. And there were lots of state dinners, glamorous state dinners. There were lots of outreach. There were lots of small dinners. I think we've had two presidents and first ladies now who just have dinner every night with their kids. And I think that's why both the Bush Jr. administration and the Obama administration, it's part of why they are not having such an easy time of it. Nancy Reagan has said to me, when you move to a new town, you get to know the neighbors. So she got to know everybody in Washington, including Kay Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post. Most of the Washington establishment is Democratic, but she had them to the White House, small lunches and dinners. They got to know her husband. They saw he wasn't this right-wing nut from California. We've had two presidents and first ladies now who have one state dinner a year, barely see anyone but their own small circle of friends and family. I think you've got to reach out to people, and you've got to have people coming to you with different points of view and different ideas. That's what Jackie Kennedy did for her husband, and that's what Nancy Reagan did for her husband.
Okay, arguably though, people would say those were people just reaching out to the same kinds of people. The other.
No, it's not true. I mean, yes, I mean they're not reaching out to the man in the street so much, but both in the Kennedy and Reagan administrations, you had people from Europe coming to the White House. You had people from all over the country. You had scientists, artists, writers. Jackie Kennedy had Tennessee Williams and Gore Vidal to the White House. Nancy Reagan, had Frank Sinatra. But, Bush Jr. was the first American president never to have David Rockefeller at the White House. Wouldn't you want to hear what David Rockefeller, who'd been a banker for 50 years, the leading banker in the country, had to say? It's not a matter of elitism. It's a matter of of making it work. You need the people who've been there before you to give you advice and to help smooth your way.
Is there a worry, though, that approaching politics as a manifestation of fame, celebrity, and culture devalues what a democracy is supposed to be about?
Yeah, I'm talking about using social life to advance as a tool of
Mm.
diplomacy. No, I think the fact that presidents and first ladies now go on comedy shows, it's like the royal family of England, giving out interviews. Once you lose your mystique, I think it's very hard to have people look up to you, and
Mm.
I think people should look up to the president and first lady, and leaders in general. I think politics has become overly concerned with the media, and it's all about sound bites, which really don't convey ideas very well, and it's all about almost saying nothing now to get elected. So, the public doesn't really know who they're voting for. They're voting for sort of an image at this point.
And just getting back to what we were saying about being in touch with the other power movers and shakers, and getting in touch with them.
And the other party, the bipart, we have a lack of bipartisanship, but nobody knows each other.
Well, when you published your biography of Ronald and Nancy Reagan, critics said that, hey, Bob, you're focusing too much on the high society aspects of their rise to power, as to the serious discussion of politics or political philosophy. What do you say to that?
Well, my book was social history. It was emphasizing their relationship and what she brought to the table. So that was more on the social side. But there's a long chapter which Walter Isaacson cited as the best description of or narrative of how Ronald Reagan went from being an FDR Democrat to a conservative Republican in the communist scare days of Hollywood in the 1940s. But the focus is on the social. I mean, Reagan came from a very poor background. I mean, that's all in the book, too. But Reagan was a person who always, Ronald Reagan, even as a boy, attracted mentors, attracted people who could help him. He was sort of this, tow-headed, likable kid who went on to be, a likable guy, and was very modest, hid his ambition under this Ashok smile, just like Andy hid his ambition. Andy pretended to be kind of dumb and made people and helpless, made us all want to do things for him.
There's this long-standing tension between the sort of two strands of North American culture, if I can put it, the more traditional sort of family values that you could say the Reagans sort of represented and his followers, and the kind of liberal, freewheeling, sexually liberated counterculture. Where does Bob Colacello see himself in that conflict?
I think I used to be in the sexually liberated. No, I think I love a Canadian writer called Mark Steyn who's talked about how culture trumps politics, and the culture today, the universities, the entertainment industry, the media is very much in the hands of the left. And so he's just recently written, it doesn't matter how many new senators the Republicans elect, because we're all thinking in sort of the countercultural way. That's become mainstream.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, it's normal now to, have gay marriage. I mean, in 1970, when I went to work for Andy
People might
Warhol,
not but that's progressive, not countercultural.
Well, it was countercultural. I mean, it was part of the sexual revolution. Having children, celebrities having children without getting married is normal, but I don't think it's setting a good example. I don't think having half the kids born today not having married parents is a good idea. Again, I'm not judging anybody in particular. I'm happy for all my friends who have found love any way they found it. But I think as a culture and I think Mark Steyn makes this very clear, but I think as a culture, Western civilization is kind of a thing of the past. We're on a suicidal path, and I don't think it's a good thing.
Jeepers. Yikes, that's a pretty big pronouncement.
Yeah, I think we're headed to disaster. I mean, on one side you have the barbarians at the gate who really believe in something, however extreme and crazy it is, and here you have a lot of wishy-washiness.
Okay. You care to expand?
Well, I mean, the elite in the West doesn't really have a religion anymore. Art is kind of the religion, which is a whole interesting discussion. I don't think people believe in anything. I think people just go along with it. I mean, we're legalizing pot. I used to smoke pot, but it's not a good thing for kids. I mean, it rots the brain. I just think we should stop and take a look at where we're heading.
This is the contradiction in you. We're seeing this trend in cultural writing to take things that are popular more seriously. So adding this element of this is very important. In the music world, it's called, poptimism. We should take Taylor Swift as seriously as we should take, I don't know, some art rock indie band. Do you find any of that encouraging?
Yeah, I mean, I think music's not my big area, but I think, yeah, if that's what Taylor Swift's about, that's
okay.
That's okay.
Art in general.
I think, Jeff Koons has a very positive, optimistic message, more or less. And I think...
Well, we're all on this suicidal mission.
Yeah,
Jeff Koons is being positive.
I don't think the culture at large is very positive. I think it is, oriented towards sensationalism and shocking, all of which is so passé. I mean, it goes back to the Dadaists, and it's tired, but yet people keep doing it. And I mean, you look at advertising, you look at video games, you look at American movies, it's all sex and violence. It's popular American culture is not sending out a very attractive picture of what America is about. And I can understand why Hindu fundamentalists or Muslim fundamentalists, or for that matter, Christian and Jewish Orthodox and evangelicals could say, I don't want my sons and daughters to be brought up this way. I don't want them exposed to this. I'm not defending the religious extremism, but I'm saying you've got to look at what are the reasons for this huge rise in religious fundamentalism all over the world. I think those of us who live in cities like Toronto and Seattle and New York and Los Angeles we're living in cocoons, and we don't really know what people out there are thinking. But they're certainly trying to send a message every so often, like in the last elections, where they're not too wild about everything that's going on.
So does art still have that power to shock us?
I find it very hard to be shocked by almost anything, and I think it's hard. I mean, what's shocking now, I think, is the decapitations by ISIS on TV. That's pretty shocking, and that's their form of reality TV, and they're using video. They're using art forms, let's say, pretty effectively for propaganda purposes. But no, I mean, am I shocked by Jeff Koons, 50-foot high pile of Play-Doh? No, I think it's funny. I think it's the mannerist form of pop art. I think art, is something that's become more and more object art. The realm of billionaires. It's another market. People trade it, which is not necessarily a good thing either.
I want to get back to Warhol and Reagan.
Yeah.
I don't know how you make the turn from that to Warhol and Reagan, but let's do it. You've made the case that they're transformative figures whose influence is still very much with us today. Do you see that kind of change that they inspired as completely positive, or is there a dark side as well?
No, I think there's a downside. There's always a downside. I mean, I think in Andy's case, this message of total freedom, total individualism, glorification of even very eccentric forms of behavior can go too far, and it has gone too far. I think with Reagan, his encouragement of capitalist culture, Reagan brought in the 80s, the yuppies replaced the hippies. Everyone was getting an MBA. I think Wall Street has certainly gone too far. I think I'm in agreement with a liberal politician like Elizabeth Warren about bring back the Glass-Steagall Act and break up the big banks. I don't think you should put your money in a bank thinking it's safe, and they're investing in whatever derivatives are. I mean, that used to be, you went to a stock brokerage for that. No, I think both Reaganism and Warholism, if you will, could be carried too far, and were at the time, and everything's become so exaggerated. I think Andy would kind of love it all because but I think Reagan would be standing there saying, hold on. I think he'd be on his horse, riding riding into the sunset, kind of disgusted about what he sees. But Andy would be, oh, gee, oh, Bob, this is so great. Why are you being so negative, Bob?
Well, let me end by asking you this. I mean, for anyone listening, well, let me say most people, Andy Warhol and Ronald Reagan are simply images. You were lucky enough to know the real man. What's the lesson on a personal level? What have those relationships taught you about the nature of fame and celebrity?
Well, I think both both Andy and Ronald Reagan, I will say, handled fame really well. They both had a modesty about them. When Andy was asked, "How do you explain your success?" he would say, "Oh, I was just in the right place at the right time. And when I was shot, I was in the wrong place at the wrong time." Ronald Reagan had a sign on his desk in the Oval Office that said, "It's amazing how much you can accomplish if you don't insist on taking credit." And I think that's one of the reasons why both were rather likable and popular figures. You didn't feel in Reagan's case that Hollywood went to his head, or even the presidency. And Andy would walk down Park Avenue on his way to work, handing out interview magazines to people. I mean, he didn't have bodyguards, even though he had been shot in 1968 by a crazy former superstar. Um, I think both were nice guys, actually. And I think being nice goes a long way. That doesn't mean they weren't both extremely ambitious. Ronald Reagan persuaded people, there's this idea out there that Nancy Reagan was the ambitious one, and she was the one who wanted to get to the White House, but he wanted it, believe me. Andy had people around him who, like Fred Hughes' manager, who had to be tough with the art dealers, but I think being nice, they both were nice guys, and I think that's part of why the public could feel that. I think, I think the message comes across. I think my job as a journalist, especially writing about people, has always been not to judge people, but to humanize them, to take a household name and make the reader feel this is what it's like to hang out with Andy Warhol or get to know the Reagans, and and then you might think the Reagans are horrible and someone else might think, oh, they're wonderful. The same thing with Andy or anybody I write about.
Well, thank you for having those qualities of being so nice and humble.
Oh,
The ones that
thank you.
Thank you for joining me today. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you.